All right. Hey, we made it to Thursday. Mr. Plog here, and we are finishing, and Layla's here. We're finishing off the week talking about Minnesota becoming the 32nd of the future 50 states of the United States. Last time we left off, we were talking about Minnesota becoming a territory, and we were just starting to talk about it heading towards that statehood possibility. And really, what needed to happen for both of those was they needed a certain amount of people, right? And we'll talk about that today. But Minnesota is right at that point now that they had a lot of expansion and people coming in, right? From like 1849 to like, I think it was 57 or something. They went from like 6,000 to 150,000 people, right? And it's from people like you that did your homework assignment yesterday that wrote all these articles and advertisements to try to get people to come out there. Also, it didn't hurt that there were plenty of jobs and really cheap land that people found out about and thought it was worth it to make that trip out there. Also, there was railroads being built out there too, which made it way faster and safer. So there were plenty of reasons. But we're going to get started. We're going to go into Google Classroom. So why don't we go ahead and do that here really quick? Okay. Believe my video is all fixed, so I shouldn't have a problem having my face in the video the whole time. All right, so the warm up for today, you're nearing Minnesota becoming the 32nd of future 50 United States. One of the requirements that they had to write the rules. And what is a rule or law you might create if you were a founder to make Minnesota a great new state? So that was your warm up. So you should have your notes in here, just like we've had it from previous days. Go ahead and either make a copy or print them out and make sure that you follow along. I think that's obviously, once again, I'm going to say it so many times until it drives you crazy. Print if you can. If you can't, go in, file, make a copy, and go along with the split screen while we're going through our slides. All right, so Minnesota's path to statehood. So one of the major things that's really, really important for Minnesota to become a state is you have to write a constitution. Now, the United States had a constitution that was passed in the 1780s. Any state and really any place that has a whole bunch of people in it that has a government has to be governed by a constitution. This is what gives government the power to do what they can, but also to restrict what they're able to do so that they can't just do whatever they want, right? So there was a group of, it looks like 30 some people that all sat down and tried to make this constitution. Well, as American politics has always shown us, a lot of these guys really didn't get along at all. So what ended up happening is they needed to get a small committee of people that were a little bit more tolerant of other people's opinions, and they met as a small group to start drafting things up. And then the rest of these guys ended up saying that they thought the changes and the compromises were okay. The two guys in the middle are really the most important, and we're going to talk about them later. But those are actually our first two state governors. And one has a city named after him and a county, and the other, I believe, has Hastings, Minnesota, is named after him. But also Henry Sibley High School in St. Paul is named after him. That's our first state governors. So there actually was a vote by the people, and it was in 1857. And Minnesota became a state in 1858 because the vote passed 30,055 to 571, which is about 98.5%. There were a few people that were afraid of Minnesota becoming a state because Minnesota was going to come in as a free state, one that didn't allow slavery. And there were some people that were concerned that it might cause there to be more free states than slave states, which in the end would maybe doom slavery to failure. We obviously think of that as a very good thing, but for people that are pro-slavery at the time, that's a very big deal because a lot of them would own slaves. And then when they became a state, Henry Sibley became their first governor, and we talked about him yesterday. All right. So really the first white settler of our entire area that comes here permanently is a guy by the name of Pig's Eye. And no, that is not his legal name. So according to this history of the city of St. Paul by John Fletcher Williams, one of the oldest buildings, one of the oldest establishments in St. Paul was in this area that you see down here. And this is what's called Fountain Cave. And it had a small stream that flowed out into the Mississippi River. The cave is, well, it unfortunately was kind of paved over. Now there's just a man-made tunnel there. But it's right in the middle of the city that we know today as St. Paul. And the first settler was a guy by the name of Pig's Eye Perron. Now, it's not parent. It's a French name, so it's pronounced Perron. And he was a retired fur trader. That used to be his thing, right? But as we talked about, once the 1800s hit, the fur trade started to slow down quite a bit. So he needed to come up with another way to make money. He already had a pretty bad reputation. He liked to fight a lot. He did drink a lot, and above all else, he tried to make money in any way possible, and he didn't care if it was legal or not, as long as he could do it. And inside Fountain Cave, he set up an illegal place that manufactured and sold alcoholic beverages called Pig's Eye Landing. There's actually a bar in St. Paul that's still named that today. It's not the original establishment. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, but it is named after him because he really is considered the very first person to set up shop in what we know today as St. Paul, which would later become our capital. So this is a manufactured picture of Pig's Eye. I don't really like this picture of him because according to what people say, that name Pig's Eye comes for a specific reason, and I don't really see it too well. You can kind of see it in this picture, but I'll show you more in just a second. So here's another picture of Pig's Eye. Perron was a coarse, ill-looking, low-browed man, as you can see right here. It looks like he's got the scowl on his face. Definitely would be afraid if I met him in a dark alley. So he had a bad eye, and that bad eye, it had a white ring around the pupil. Pigs have eyes that look like that. That's why they called him that. And he would do anything that he could to sell this liquor that he would create and manufacture, right? He would go over territory lines in North Dakota. He would sneak over into Wisconsin because he could hop on the river and make it over the border, no problem. And he would sell it to anybody who would take it, right? But he ends up becoming incredibly successful. People find that he does business, and eventually they start settling around him, and St. Paul would kind of build on top of him being their first settler. This is what his eye probably would have looked like. I found some like really scary pictures online. This was one of the more tolerable ones. But this is someone wearing a contact lens. But it's the idea that they have just that pupil, and then after that, it's like they have no coloring in their eye or no iris. I think that's what it would have looked like. And that does happen to a lot of people when they get eye injuries. So there are some people that think that he might have gotten stabbed, punched, or shot in that eye. But I couldn't find any reports as to what actually happened. Maybe he was born that way too. So it's interesting because St. Paul's a very religious name, right? And the United States is supposed to be not religion free, but not endorsing a particular religion. And St. Paul clearly is a Christian name for a city. So there are some people in the 1990s that thought that they should rename the city of St. Paul. And one of the proposed names for it was the city of Pig's Eye because it represents Pig's Eye Perron, who was the very first person who permanently lived there that was white. So, I mean, personally, if that would become the state capital in Minnesota, I think that'd be a little bizarre, but it is kind of an interesting thought. All right, so moving on to a couple other really famous people early on in Minnesota. We mentioned him earlier, but this is Henry Sibley. By the way, if you've ever seen a picture of Edgar Allan Poe, I think he looks ridiculously similar to him, and Poe was a scary guy. So he's the first governor of Minnesota. Originally, he was a lawyer, and he worked his way up in the American Fur Company. He was a lawyer for them. Obviously, the fur company carried a lot of weight in Minnesota in the beginning. And eventually, once the fur trade started to dry up, he tried to branch out and do different things. And he ended up becoming really two different things. Number one, he became a politician. And then the second thing is he ended up going into the military. So he was the first person to be sent as a delegate to Congress, which is only with two S's. And eventually he was the one that really spearheaded that 61 men in Stillwater and the 49 that organized the Minnesota Territory. And eventually he's going to be one of the highest ranking military officers that leads U.S. soldiers against the Dakota in the U.S. Dakota War, which we're going to talk about next week early on. But he has a great reputation. He's the first governor, and well, like I said, he has a high school named after him in St. Paul, and yeah, he really did a lot to get Minnesota started, at least. But he doesn't stay governor for very long. In fact, he only goes in for one term. So this is him once he moves on to his military career as an officer. He was a cavalryman. So here's our second governor, and this is him as a very young man. This is Alexander Ramsey. Probably heard of Ramsey County. He was a immigrant of Scottish and German ancestry, and he really was more of a politician from the get-go. He didn't start out in the fur trade and then become a military man. Instead, Alexander Ramsey basically focused on law and being a politician right from the start. And he was a very young man, right around, I think it was probably when he looked like this. He became one of the very first mayors of St. Paul when it became a city. And then after Sibley left, he ended up becoming the second governor of Minnesota. And it's kind of a fluke, but he ended up becoming the very first governor to commit soldiers to the Union Army during the Civil War. When war broke out, he just happened to be in Washington because he wanted to talk to then President Lincoln. And he was supposed to have a meeting with him. And right before Lincoln declared war, and he had told Alexander Ramsey that they had started. So Ramsey just happened to be the very first one, right? Because there were no telephones back then. So it wasn't like you could just give the president a call. But Minnesota does have that distinction. And as we're going to talk about next week, Minnesota does have an incredible reputation when it comes to the Civil War, probably one of the best out of all of the Union states. He ended up being voted in as a Republican, which today the Republican Party is a little bit different than it was back then. This was the party that was really in favor of abolishing slavery. So he was a big proponent of that. And obviously Minnesota was a free state, so that made sense. But he ended up serving for a lot longer than Sibley did as governor. But then eventually he stepped down to become a United States senator. Now you would think, wow, a governor would probably be a higher rank than a U.S. senator. But remember, the Senate at the time, it still is, but it was a very revered body in which people could make laws for the United States government. And at the time, it was considered to be a much higher post than a state governor, especially a brand new, very small state. So he served for a really, really long time, and then eventually would retire and then pass away not too long after. This is what he would have looked like probably when he was the governor of Minnesota. You can actually go tour in Ramsey County. They have the Ramsey House. It's still a historical place. You can go in there. And once COVID ends up going away, or at least is manageable, you can actually go and tour it. I think you might have to pay, but I don't think it's very expensive. As a teacher, I get free admission on the Minnesota Historical Society stuff. So I'm not sure about that. I'll have to look at that. But definitely recommend it. All the historical sites around here, like Fort Snelling and stuff, I think are really, really interesting. So, all right, ladies and gentlemen, let's just look really quickly here, going over to your exit ticket. All right, you got 4 questions today. Don't forget to get those done, and obviously do them before your assessment's posted at 4, because I would be willing to bet that you're probably going to have a lot of stuff that's from this exit ticket on that weekly assessment. Okay. All right. Well, in that case, I'll leave you be. Have a great weekend. And as always, make good choices. And we'll see you on Monday when we start talking about tensions rising between Native Americans and these new white Minnesotans. All right. See you later.